All right, I think we're going to get started. I am super excited to have you all, and it's going to be really fun. It's going to be really fun. Most important part is that this is useful to you, so I really hope you'll share your questions and ask what's on your mind. But we're going to get started. So I am Matt Vanadley. I'm the founder and CEO of a software company called Sema. We make products to help with code quality and help developers advance their careers. What we're going to talk today is about an accomplishment journal or a brag book, depending on how you like to define it. I'll start with just a few minutes, a few moments of background about me, so you know the context that I'm coming from. And then we have 5 questions that I'm going to talk through, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. What is an accomplishment journal or brag book? Number 1. Number 2, what are the reasons to do them? Number 3, how do I think about the feeling of bragging as opposed to if it feels, if the phrase bragging feels wrong, what's another way to think about it? How can I frame it to myself to be as useful as possible? Number 4, what are the components of an effective, I call them a story or maybe a journal article, the different parts of an accomplishment journal. What are the best ways to write them so that they're as useful as possible down the road? And then finally, some tips and tricks on doing it on a regular basis. As Edgar and I were just talking about, getting into a habit of doing it is so important because it's much easier to do it in the moment than to do it later. So with that, let's jump in. So just briefly, a bio about me. I learned to code when I was very young. My parents are coders. And then I moved over to the business and organizational side of technology. I've worked with nonprofits, I've worked with government agencies, and I worked in the private sector for companies with software, with implementing technology systems, data and analytics. And then I left to found Sema because of a passion for code quality and a passion for helping developers advance their learning and advance their skills. Personally, for many years, I kept an accomplishments journal in the form of every 3 months, I would make a note to add to my resume. I kept a long a Word document and just added bullet points to it every 3 months. When I needed a new resume, I would have it available. I also, and we'll talk about this too for tips and tricks, kept a folder of all of the compliments that colleagues, bosses, clients said about me. That's another really important part of building a great brag book. So question 1, what are they? What is an accomplishment journal or brag book? And I see McCall just joined, who suggested a better term, an additional term besides brag book. But basically it's keeping track. It's a systematic way of keeping track of all of the things you've done, at least that are successful. And I'd say more broadly, where you've worked really hard, where you figured something out, where you've achieved something. It is updated regularly. So there's a notion of it's a journal rather than a one-time thing. It's really a good idea if you can get yourself into the habit of it, of maintaining an accomplishment journal or brag book rather than trying to remember it at points when you might need it. In particular, if you're going up for a promotion or a raise, or if you're building a resume. So it's a regular. A third dimension is that it's private to you. You can obviously use it at some point in the future to share it with others. But the first and most important part is you build it for your own sake. And the fourth element I'd say is that it's about moments or stories. Many of us, myself included, spend our days in in logic, in data, in trying to interpret data. Humans respond best in almost all circumstances to stories, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Here's what I started with. Here's where it ended. We'll talk about some of the tips in question 4 of how to build journal entries that are based on those moments, those creating stories. So why do them? We talked about this a little, but I'd say first principle, it is much easier to read something than it is to remember. That's true, has a lot of implications, especially in software projects. That's why we do care about documentation and so forth. But it's even true for your own life. Reading about something that you wrote is way easier than trying to remember it. And so codifying this, codifying what you've been up to on a regular basis makes it much easier for you to come back to it. I like to think of the reasons for an accomplishment journal in 2 different categories. One is about career advancement, and let's say outside of yourself, if you will. And then the second is about personal development, so personal to you. So for career advancement, very obviously, having a good list of things that you've really achieved makes it much easier to update your resume and keep it fresh. It makes it a lot easier to be a part of annual performance review processes. Some large organizations call them perfs, but where you have to present data back to make the case for why you should get a promotion, to why a friend of yours should get a promotion. Sometimes you're giving advice on multiple people, and so keeping that list is really helpful. It's also, even on top of your resume, really useful to keep track of experiences that can become interview responses. So not every organization interviews based on experience interviews, but many of them do. And it's always a good idea to be ready for experience interviews because those can be the answers to many, many different kinds of questions. Those of you who haven't been part of an experience interview before, it's basically asking someone to share an experience and tell someone about an experience that you've done, usually successfully, but always about where you've worked really hard at something. At Sema, when we hire, the interview question is, tell me about a time when you worked on something really hard. Tell me what you did, what made it difficult, why was it difficult, and then what happened. When we think about it, it can be a team effort frequently, of course, especially in joint projects when you're working as part of a team. But in that moment, in an experience interview, you really need to be able to focus on your own contributions, what you did yourself, how you advised or coached others. And so being as detailed as possible about your own contributions is really important. Even in organizations that are pretty modest on a regular basis, need you to be direct and brag a little about what you've done in that moment so that they know if you're talking about a team effort, you can distinguish what you have done so that it gives them confidence that hiring you will have that same effect. Because maybe if it was a team effort, you weren't the person who made those major contributions. So like I said, 2 reasons, 2 groups of reasons to build accomplishment journals and brag books. One is about career advancement, and the other is about internal to you, personal development. I'm a really, really, really big fan of self-exploration, of charting your own journey and interpreting it. One of the ways that you can use, and I really recommend using an accomplishment journal, is just to reflect on it, say every 3 months or so, and think about not only what did you do well, of course that's important, but even more important for your personal journey is what you liked and what you didn't like. And perhaps it's a story for another time, but just to think about it a little, if you're maintaining a system of things you did well as part of an accomplishment journal or brag book, it's not that hard to also then add other moments, whether or not they were successful or not, but things that you did, and then to add extra columns to talk about what was the effect. Was it good? Did it lead to a good result or a less good result? But also, what did I think about it? What were some of the elements that I liked and some of the elements that I didn't like? And the reason for that is you can, I think career advice and career planning is so idiosyncratic. It's so personal to what you want to do with your life, that looking at your own evidence of what you liked and liked more and liked less is so much more important than what anybody else might say or what you're supposed to do or things like that. And so having these moments, not just for your for external use, if you will, but for you to reflect and then help guide your career to spending more time rather than less in the areas you like is hugely important. Small example for me, when I was in undergraduate in university, I became the head of an activist group at my college. We were working on making the university more inclusive, and I was the head of this university organization. We made some good success. We persuaded the university administration to make some improvements. And so for the brag part, for the accomplishment journal, I could talk about those. But I also learned that it wasn't the right fit for me to be in an activist role where I was outside of the organization trying to agitate for the organization to make better changes. I realized at that moment, it didn't feel quite right for me. And when I compared it to other experiences I had had to that point, I learned that I was much happier advocating within an organization, leading an organization and making it more inclusive, making it more diverse from within. And so that moment, which has served me right, that is definitely the kind of person I am, came from first me writing about the accomplishment of leading the student club and some of the things we'd achieved. It turned out to be really meaningful for me as I thought about shaping my career. And then finally, and shout out to Emma, who's not available today, but she suggested this in prep for this. A brag book and accomplishment journal can help you fight imposter syndrome. Of course, this feeling that we're not good enough, that we don't deserve to be where we are. Almost all of us have that feeling at least occasionally. It's an extremely common, I'd say, pretty human experience. What's nice, I'm smiling. I'm the son of a math teacher, computer programmer and math teacher, and my other parent is a computer programmer. So I always like going back to the data. The conversation you have with yourself about whether or not you're good at something one of the ways to manage that differently is to have the actual data. Well, you're worried you're not enough of a coder. By the way, if you're coding, you're a coder. But look at this list that you have said. In addition, this list of things you have built, of what you have learned, use that data to negotiate, so to speak, with your inner voice, with your inner voice and inner critic. So that's question 2. Why do an accomplishment journal or a brag book? Let's do question 3. Sometimes it's the idea of a brag book, the concept of it doesn't feel great. How to think about a brag book if you were a more modest person, or you like thinking about the contributions. You're not quick to think about your own contributions or what you've done for yourself. First off, if you feel that way, huge congratulations. That speaks well of your groundedness and the awareness of how much other people are responsible for a team's success and an organization's success. Second, think about a different name. And even in building this, in the spirit of learning in public, it was going to be how to build a brag book. And As someone suggested, you know you are, we could call it an accomplishment journal. Really, the most important thing is to do the work, of writing it down, of writing down your what you've achieved, what you've learned in a way that feels normal and comfortable to you. The point is collecting the data, however you call it, on a regular basis, and in a detailed way. If we tie it back, again, some motivation for folks who are skeptical of really why to do this. So remember, there's career-based reasons, and there's internal personal development-based reasons. It really matters on both of those fronts. On career advancement side, it would be nice if we lived in a world where organizations were really good at determining who was responsible for what and giving credit and kudos and tangible rewards based on objective reality. That is not the way the world works. And so to folks I care about, I say we have to meet the world where it is. And in a world where being able to communicate about your accomplishments, articulate them, and matters, in part because other people are doing them as well, and learning the communication side and being able to articulate it is more fair to you, and frankly, it leads to a more fair set of outcomes for everyone involved than if only some people are able to keep track of their accomplishments and other folks are not. So for career advancement, it really matters, and it leads to a more just answer if everyone is doing this. And then on the personal development side, I'm sure you could tell by the way I talked about it, to have years, decades of experience, of a list of things you have done, what you have learned, how successful it was, what you thought about it. There's just nothing better for figuring out what matters to you, what you do next, how you spend your time inside work, frankly, and outside of time. So, okay, let's get to question 4. What are the successful components? What are the important components of a good accomplishment journal or brag book? There's really 2 parts. One is compliments you have received, and the second is actual stories themselves. So the compliment side is relatively straightforward. Every single time you're getting feedback from someone, another person, another team, a boss's boss, a peer, someone who's working for you, save it in a folder. And if you're getting them from multiple channels, some from Slack, some from Discord, some from wherever, all put them in one spot, copy and paste them, so you have a running list. One reason for that, it feels good to look at it once in a while, especially if you've had a hard day or hard week of just remembering how people how highly they thought of you. And second is it's just going to be really useful for adding detail to the stories of demonstrating the success of these moments. The second part are these components of the story itself, the components of the journal. I sometimes call them stories. You can call them journal entries. Let's call them journal entries today, in keeping with the idea of an accomplishment journal. Most important thing is a method that works for you. It is better to have a sort of good accomplishment journal structure, but fill it out regularly, than it is to have a perfect one that you're never going to fill out. This is definitely a moment of scrappiness that serves you well. And so if the simplest way you want to do it is, okay, I remember this thing happened, it was really cool, I'm glad that it worked, and that's all you write, and you just have a list of those, that is way better than only doing it every 6 months or every year when you can do it in a formal way. Because reading, as I said earlier, reading things is a lot more helpful than trying to remember them. If you don't have a format that you're already using, there are 2 that I have found to be quite successful, 2 methods of creating journal entries. One is a newspaper story, and the other is using a logic model. So let me talk about each of those. Maybe perhaps one of those or a combination might be useful for you. So a newspaper story, if you've ever been a journalist, great. It should be easier. If not, think about the components of a newspaper article and then write those down. If you're a database person or a Google Sheets or Excel person, you can put in a grid. If not, put in documents, wherever, just trying to answer these questions consistently. When did this thing happen? Who was involved? Team members, clients, stakeholders, bosses, whoever. So who was involved? What was the problem you're trying to solve? I should say, by the way, I will not only save a video of this, but turn it into a blog. So don't need to take notes. I'll make sure folks have access to this afterwards. So when did it happen? Who was involved? What was the problem you were trying to solve? Did anything make it hard? Especially if you're ever going to get to an experience interview, understanding the difficulty level is really important because it shows how much work was necessary to achieve it. How did you solve it? So what steps did you and others take? Could be coding, but could also be communication and listening, and there's many other things that go into it: planning, design, documentation, all of the different things. It's not just about the coding. Sometimes the coding is the smallest part, and planning and picking is much harder, or communicating or persuading. If other people were involved, which is frequently the case, what was your contribution and what was their contribution? That's why I said earlier, if you're going to use this in an interview or for reviews, you need to be able to accurately and respectfully articulate what you did as it relates to what other people did. Can't just be about. It will be more persuasive. Maybe that's the right way to say it. If it's about your interaction with others. I sometimes think of this as writing a screenplay. So if you did this, how did other people respond? And what did you say after that? How did other people respond? But trying to articulate how other people were involved, especially for folks doing interviews, that's really important. And then finally, what happened? What happened as a result of your work? There is a hierarchy. Maybe it's not fair, but it's definitely the case. But there's a hierarchy of what kinds of results matter for any of the external use cases: career advancement, or finding a new job. Highest ranked is objective reality results. And so if you're in a software organization, objective reality results could be decreasing the number of bugs, could be increasing sales on a project. It could be stars, GitHub stars on an open source repo. I think that's a pretty good one, and certainly use of it. But in the real objective world, before you take anyone's subjective assessment into it, is the highest form. So if you have any evidence of objective reality results, you should include those. Then would come comparison to others. Just even saying that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But since we're in the accomplishments journal or bragging, being able to put yourself in context objectively is really helpful to the reader, of the story. And it could be, you think about grade point average. If everyone in your major, so in the US, there's a 4.0 scale at many institutions. If everyone in your major gets a 4.0, that's much less persuasive than if you were number one in your class. And having number one in your class or in your major, even if your grade point average is 3.0, is much better than being one of hundreds of people who all got 4.0. Think about that. What kind of rigor or degree would it be if you were in a program where everyone got aced it? It's probably not that, probably wouldn't be that hard. And so being able to put yourself objectively in comparison, or your team in comparison, those objective comparisons are really important. Next comes the opinions. So we're into subjective opinion of, I'll just list the categories. Bosses, for sure, bosses and bosses, users and customers. All of those matter, their subjective opinions matter more than the next category of your colleagues' opinions, which could be peers on your team, could be folks reporting to you. Maybe that's self-evident, but the logic is customers, users, management, they have one degree or another power over you in a way that's more true than peers on a team or people reporting to you. Again, many exceptions. It's not just about that, but as a general rule, and it's true. And so when folks with greater power are choosing to share subjective positive feedback, can be a very strong indication. Final part that is least important for those external use cases is your own subjective opinion. What did you think of went well? What did you think? How do you think it turned out? Now, if you're doing experiential interviews, it's really important to be able to articulate your own assessment. It's a good way to tell if someone's learning oriented or not. And you're being able to say, I thought I did this well, or we did this well, but we could do it better next time, is music to interviewers' ears. When it comes, so those are all the external, that's how we would measure it for external uses of the accomplishment journal or brag book. For the internal use case, for personal exploration and career planning, literally the opposite is true. Can go all the way through. What you think about how well you did and also how much you liked it or didn't like it matters way more than extreme objective reality results. I'm sure you've all been on projects that were personally incredibly satisfying and didn't matter, so to speak, in terms of objective results. Those two things can be extremely independent. For career planning, it's nice when those two align, but for your own sake, keeping track of how you felt about it, how you thought you did you enjoy it, how far you got or your team got, that's really important. So keeping track of each of these matters, but in those flip use cases. Talked about one way of thinking about the actual journal entry of the newspaper story, and then some of the measures of how to measure success. The other approach is a logic model. I'll send a link to it if you're not familiar with it. I found it about a decade ago, and I think it's one of the best logical frameworks for understanding anything, but also works in particular for building journal entries. So a logic model has 4 parts. There are resources, there are activities, there are outputs, and there are outcomes. Let's define those, and let's use football in the global sense, not American football sense, to illustrate each of them. So resources is what you had at your disposal in terms of time, money, people. What did you have to work with? For a football team, you would have team members. Exactly, Raheel, exactly. The true football, as much as I like American football, the true football. So team members are a resource. Having equipment, a stadium, those are resources. Activities is the work that is done with those resources. And so you might have 10 2-hour practices and 1 90-minute match, the game itself. Outputs and outcomes, so those are similar, are what happened as a result of the activities you used with those resources. They're very similar. And I should say this is probably slightly my flavor of outputs versus outcomes. I'll send you the literature if you want to come up with your own. But to me, the most important part of the difference is outcomes really matter, and outputs are things that help contribute to outcomes. And so it's an art and a science. There is no hard, fast rule on outputs, on creating outputs, or what's an output versus what's an outcome. The rule, but the think about is someone who is an objective observer, what would really matter to them? How would they view this? Of course, in the football context, an output could be your team controlled the ball for 70% of the game. Your team had 20 shots on goal versus 10 for the opponents. So again, back to comparison to others, could be you personally had shots on goal. Outcomes, however, are winning the game, especially winning the game in context. So having 20 shots on goal to your opponent's 10 shots, that's an outputs measure in comparison to others. An outcomes measure in comparison to others is we are the seventh ranked team, and we beat the second ranked team. Again, putting it in context for the reader who doesn't need to know much to know, well, 7 is substantially less good than second. It means something a lot if you're the 7th and you beat the 2nd. Hopefully, this will be imprinted on your brain whenever you're building not just an accomplishment journal, but a resume or writing a document or whatever. Always, thank you. Always put it. Always be sure to think about what really matters and what matters to someone on the outside. You may personally care a lot about, let's again back to football. I really had, I had a nice move and juked a defender to an outsider, unless they're really, really involved and really, really invested in your own own development or your own play. Maybe they're your coach or an agent or something like that. They don't care in that moment nearly as much about what happened in that moment. They care if you won the game or not. Winning isn't everything in any sorts of areas, but if you're in the moment of telling your story, put it in the context of what people care about. I'll say one more thing on this topic because before we finish, it's probably obvious, but just to say it, the outcomes should relate to the work of you or your team or the people related to that story, in the story that you're telling. Gary Lee, the amazing tech writer, ex-Uber and others, shared this last week. He had the great privilege to be a major contributor to the engineering team, to an engineering team at Uber, and he talked about he personally wasn't responsible for Uber growing from X hundred people to X thousand people over a period of time. Great question. Let me get to it in one sec. And so saying if you're going to pick outcomes, they should be outcomes that should be tied to the story. They should not be tied to outcomes tied to the story, not to your work, to the work, not to something unrelated. The HR department is responsible for being able to hire hundreds and thousands of people. The engineering team is not. Obviously, they built a product that drove more usage, but the outcomes really need to tie. We have a fifth question. What are best practices on how to set yourself up for keeping track of your accomplishment journal on a regular basis? But let's pause because we already have some questions. Great. How do you teach this context when a person is pivoting into tech with a completely different career from tech? And so if I understand right, how would you create a journal entry that would be persuasive in technology, even if you don't have technology in the technology field, even if you don't have technology experience already? I will answer that question along the way. If I've not captured it correctly, rewrite and I'll answer it. First and foremost, it's hard. If you are trying to break into a field that you don't already have expertise in, that is harder than being expanding on something that you already know. So if you want to work on it, amazing. Obviously, there's so many great reasons to enter a world of tech, but don't beat yourself up. Recognize that you're on a journey that what you can do is do your best and set yourself up best for success. But know that it's hard. Second, and it's a little bit of a non-answer, the more experiences you can have, yes, chicken egg syndrome. You cannot gain entry because you do not have experience. Well said. The second thing I would say is, it's a little unfair, but I think the best advice is meets the world where it is rather than the world as we would want it to be. And so I try to give advice like that. There are a few ways where without experience, you can develop tech experience. If you are interested in a writing career or a community career in technology, then you should absolutely be writing about tech and you should be engaging with communities. So let's say you're aiming for a developer relations, DevRel job, or a tech writer job. You can today, tomorrow, whenever, write about technology topics. You can engage others in learning from them, and writing up your experiences. So you can start doing that work, which will then translate into related experiences. On the coding side, I'm biased because I have some very good friends who are leaders of open source communities, but I think I'm right. The best way to develop technology experience, coding experience, is to join open source projects and contribute. You should pick projects that are welcoming to newcomers and have not only good first projects, but also have a culture of welcoming and inclusivity. And you should help. You should contribute first by writing answers, by solving tickets, issues that are suitable for first timers, then ultimately reviewing pull requests, then ultimately potentially even being a maintainer. I am literally in the middle of writing up a piece from an interview with Kunal, who many of you know, I think all of you know, about the ways that using open source can advance your career. At the AD Hub team did a piece on this. I'll share links to both of those. But maybe a minute on breaking into tech with open source. If you, as a coder, do what you can. Yes, exactly. Thank you for sharing that, Raheel. First and foremost is get to a baseline level of technical skill in some language or framework, whether that's through tutorials, whether that's through classes. Find a way to get to a baseline level, so you're not walking in to an open source project trying to contribute knowing nothing. Once you have a baseline level, then find an open source project where that level of skill is useful, skill and knowledge is useful, and be of use. So if you're a beginner JavaScript coder, go find a JavaScript project that is open, particularly open to newcomers. Don't jump ahead to Java. If you wanted to jump, or some other language. Be useful because one, you're going to learn more by building on what you already know, Second, the feedback you're going to get and the growth you're going to get is higher because you're learning more going from, actually, I was going to say you're learning more going from a junior to mid, from a senior to mid than mid to junior. I'm not always sure that's true. So let me scratch that. The bigger reason is you'll be able to accomplish more. So if you know something about JavaScript, you're going to be able to help make a project better. And back to building accomplishment journals or brag books, the point here is to demonstrate, remember that the hierarchy, objective reality results includes, did you help build or did you build this feature or not? And was this feature used by others or not? That matters a lot more than for the purposes of building a portfolio, a story in your accomplishment journal, than your opinion of, well, I went from a junior, from beginner to advanced beginner. That might be true, that's subjective assessment. What matters more is real world outcomes. Okay, so I hope that answered the question on, using an accomplishment journal to break into tech if you're not already starting in tech. Let me take the last question, question 5. Best practices for creating an accomplishment journal, for filling out journal entries on a regular basis, and then we'll see if there's any other questions. 3 parts, I'd say, 3 categories of suggestions. 1, make your contributions frequent enough. Second, get into a habit. And third, create this, set it up in a way that's the easiest possible for you. So frequently enough. How frequently should you be doing this? Absolutely no less frequently than every 3 months. That's the barest minimum, because you're going to forget time. So at least every 3 months. The rule of thumb for me is you should be setting aside time for creating journal entries at least every 1/12 of your experience, however long that experience is. So if you're at a job and you love it and you're not planning on going anywhere for years, let's say for 3 years, every 1/12 is every 3 months. And so that's about right if you really have no plans to go anywhere. If you're in a boot camp or you're working an open source project and you're going to plan on working on it for, let's say, a quarter, you're going to give it a very concentrated 3 months worth of work, again, either an open source project or a boot camp class, 1/12 of the time is every week. So setting aside every week for this. You can see we're going to try to make it as pleasant as possible, as not burdensome as possible. But that's enough frequency for you to have individual moments that you can go talk about later. You've perhaps heard the famous expression, it is easier to tear down than to build up. One of the uses of that story is it's easy to criticize people than it is to do the work, which I think is of course true. But another implication is it is much easier to edit than it is to write. Much easier to edit than it is to write. So putting it down every week, for example, gives you a lot of material to use later. Not every moment, if you have 2 moments a week from a boot camp lasts 12 weeks, 2 times 12, 24. You're not going to add all 24 of those moments to your resume. But man, if you have 24 to pick from, it's going to be a lot easier to pick 3 to 6 than for you to remember at the end of it. So 1/12 of the way through is a rule of thumb. That was method 1, do it frequently enough. Number 2, get into a habit. People a lot smarter than me have great tips on what does it take to build habits. I have a calendar invite. So a calendar invite, not just to remind myself, but to set aside time, especially if you're in a work context. Setting aside time for writing is so important because you're always going to have things that are distracting you, getting in the way, Slack messages, whatever. And so literally blocking it and shutting off everything else during that time, as long as you're not on call or something urgent, is a really good way to make sure that you do it. Obviously not just true for this, but anything that requires deep thinking time. Do it at the time of day that is most comfortable for you for writing, whatever that is. And if you track your habits, if you have a tracking method, track. And if you're the sort of person who, if this is unpleasant or scary, find a way to reward yourself. We actually didn't talk about this earlier, but especially if you're using an accomplishment journal for getting over imposter syndrome, then having a buddy to share this with confidentially, so only the two of you see it, that could be a really nice bonus or reward, so to speak. From my experience, many people who are who experience imposter syndrome for themselves or harsh critics of themselves are frequently much kinder to others, especially much kinder to their friends, much more generous in their interpretations. And so sharing, if you're using this for getting over imposter syndrome, having a buddy to share this with, you'll get boosted by a friend and you'll also boost that other person. So that can be very nice. I said it earlier, totally agnostic on the method. Handwrite it if you're tired of typing. Type it into a notepad, type it into a spreadsheet, type it into GitHub or other version control system. Literally no wrong way to put it. What you're trying to do is make it as easy as possible to unblock writing it, to make it as likely as possible as you write. That is actually the third rule. So I sort of jumped to it as well. Whatever part is easiest, whatever way is easiest. Writing is hard, editing is much easier. And so find a way to make it easy for you. Good. So this was the talk. I'm so excited, honored to have you here. Happy to take questions. It sounds like, I'll just read this, and McCall, you can choose to share. And I apologize, I know we've spoken, I know we've emailed, but have not spoken. So if I'm mispronouncing your name, I deeply apologize. You'll have to correct me. It says that McCall is sharing building side projects as a great demonstration here if I'm pivoting. So if you feel like talking about it or writing about it, you're welcome to, but absolutely no obligation. Does anyone have any questions or anything that they would like to bring up? Could I share some templates for brag books? Absolutely. I'll put some together and attach them to the article. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, I'm so grateful. I'm creating a whole, I love this. I'm creating a whole timeline of my journey and accomplishments on GitHub. Can we consider that? Absolutely. What you really want to do, it's a really important element of your, yes, two great questions. So what about the whole timeline of your journey and accomplishments on GitHub? Does that count as an accomplishments journal? And then second, how to use this brag book in the performance review without sounding braggy? Two amazing questions. So timeline of journey and accomplishments on GitHub. Absolutely, you can use that. And they've built phenomenal tooling to help make this possible. The most important thing to remember is it must be inclusive of wherever you need a set of materials that cover all of it, so you can put it together at the right time in the right place. If you are, and what I'm thinking of is, if you are getting positive feedback on Twitter, on a Discord channel, on individual correspondence, you also need to be saving the compliments. Do you need every single one? No, you do not. EddieHub is an extremely positive and supportive place. You do not need to keep track of every one, but you should make sure you have a sample of them and save particularly good ones. And of course, in GitHub, you want 100% of your code to be reflected in your accomplishment journal. So if the only thing, the public README file is a lot about public contributions, although if you haven't seen it, I believe it's either in beta or generally available, but somewhat secret. You can actually start using the GitHub squares on even non-public contributions. It's whatever way you want 100% of your experience. So if you have public projects, private projects, school projects, they should all get to one place. Start it in a scrappy way, so you make sure you have all the raw material. You're very welcome. Thank you. In a scrappy way, it depends, and I'm happy to look at it, but I would say a timeline of your journey and accomplishments on GitHub, that feels a little bit like a finished product, or maybe it's a work in progress. Love it. If you have the energy to work on that every week, amazing. The accomplishment journal can turn into the final product, where like the final product is a resume or otherwise, on a weekly basis. But most important is you get the raw material down. I'm a broken record on this. Don't feel like you're only going to update your public profile, and that's the only time you're going to write stuff down. Make sure you're getting all the raw material. Tips to how to use this brag book in the performance review without sounding braggy. That's a really good question. It is team and culture specific. On how performance reviews work. And so, or the culture of that team and that company. And so I'd say the first place is to be really curious. If a performance review process is coming up, I would get your manager, ask your manager for advice, and I would ask seniors around you, or people who've been there longer. So they don't have to be senior by years of experience, but in the organization, to learn from them. As you know, as you may know, one of the most amazing sentences or phrases in the English language is, "What you have done is so interesting. I would love to learn from you. Can you tell me more?" There are very few people who do not want to share their experience. It's the human condition. And so I would ask around, what are techniques for, what are best practice techniques for including the contents of a brag book into the performance review process? I would, I want to go back to that hierarchy for a second, and let me add a little bit of nuance. There's objective reality results that are, let's just take coding for the moment. There are objective reality results about the code, but there are also objective reality results about the business. And so within objective reality, and so the tip is, the more you can tie what you've done coding to business results, it may or may not sound braggy, but it is more and more persuasive to more and more people in the organization. Because it's true, it's true and persuasive. Always trying to think about the business impact. So let me try to give a hierarchy, starting from least important to most important, still of objective reality. Objective reality results could be, I refactored the front end of our website, and I introduced, I went from an old framework to React. So that is an objective reality result. The website is now different, and you can prove it's true. A better result, saying that is one part of objective reality results. A higher level of objective reality results, and I would include all of them, but to show you which one that's better, is it now takes engineers 20% less time to work on our front end than previously. I know this is obvious, but that has to be true, and it has to be directly related to as a result of switching the framework. But we all know that investments like that could actually produce greater, remove blockers for engineers. You should absolutely go try to find that data. If ask a product manager, ask your manager, hey, I was working on this. I'd love to know what happened if it's not immediately obvious to me. Or my sense is I can see us moving faster because I looked at the Jira board and I see that we have more story points completed than we did a few months ago. I think it's related to that work that we did or that I did on changing the framework. What do you think? That's probably another point. If you are bragging, if you're going to use this in a performance review, the person you're bragging to has to agree. So be honest about that. Even better is trying to get advice on some regular basis on whether or not they agree that what you did had that contribution. So objective reality level 1, I literally carried out a refactoring. Objective reality level 2 is it had this following result on the engineering team: improved code quality, improved engineering throughput, metrics like that. Level 3 is business or customer impact. As a result of fixing this bug, we had 15 customers who cared about this, and we fixed it and they were happy. As a result of finishing this product, we built this product and it now has X $100,000 of revenue. Of course, I run a code quality and developer improvement business. We care deeply about making code better and helping coders better, helping them improve their skills. But what really matters to organizations is the organizational impact. That's the kind of outcomes, but at the organizational level. So what happens to users of the product, customers, revenue, measures like that? If your manager isn't thinking about those, your manager's manager definitely is. And the more you can put your results into that, the better, the less it's bragging, I suppose, but it's showing how much you care about the organization's success. And there are very few organizations that don't reward people knowing what the big picture goal is and then seeing how their contributions result. Again, you have to be accurate. Engineers weren't responsible for the growth in hiring at Uber, but they certainly were responsible for code quality impact, engineering efficiency, effectiveness output, and of course, growth as they built new products. So it has to be accurate. What if the organization is an academic institution and not a money-oriented one? I love that question. And I've had the great pleasure of working in not just business, but also governments, school districts, nonprofits. I really, really, really come back to the logic model. I learned that actually, I learned it and I learned how important it was when I was doing nonprofit work. The good news and the bad news about capitalism is that profit and revenue are very clear. It's a small number of metrics that organizations can be boiled down to. Separate conversation about other kinds of metrics like ESG and DEI. But one of the things that's clear about working in business is you can see, well, the most important measures almost always are profit or revenue. Employee well-being is arguably on that list no matter what, but it's a short list. Nonprofits, broadly defined, NGOs, educational institutions, governments, have almost the exact opposite problem, which is there are so many different ways to make a difference. And there are so many different possible measures of success, and there's so many trade-offs. It's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to measure, to figure out what the small number of, to figure out outputs, and especially hard to pick outcomes. I would honestly, it's my honest answer, that's how I would do it. What I know now about working in nonprofits and governments, I would find a buddy who is also really keen to understand the impact of the organization and try to figure out authentic and accurate ways to measure it. If you're in a position of authority, you can assert, hey, I want us to do this together. But even if you're not, you can find a partner to work on it. And honestly, I would build a logic model. I would think about the resources. I think about the activities. In school districts, it's time spent on teaching, time spent on professional development, community engagement. There's so many activities. Then you would build the full list of I typically start with outputs. What is literally everything that comes out of this? For school districts, it's jobs for teachers, jobs for administrators, students learning, students having better health outcomes, students having educational outcomes. Schools, which I know well, hundreds or thousands of these metrics, but at least get you, 20. From those 20, pick the ones that matter most. And how do you figure out what matters most? That's really hard. Maybe a couple personas of, so in school districts, if I was a student, what would I say is most important? If I was a parent, if I was a politician, if I was the head of the organization. So think of how if I was a newspaper journalist or a concerned citizen, and seeing if you imagine interviewing them, what they would say. Depending on the circumstances, you could actually interview them if you weren't sure. Once you have those outcomes, I definitely would lead with them in the accomplishment journal or brag book, and definitely in resumes and talking about experiences. It is, because it's so hard in organizations that have complex, nuanced outcomes, it's with many different activities not done by you but by others, it's really hard and it's somewhat rare in my experience to have a really tight logic model. And so having a tight logic model when you're building an accomplishment journal is and then a resume and then talking about it is incredibly important. Higher ed, probably the most fundamental. There's so many different. It's so beautiful. It's higher education institutions contribute to the local economy, contribute to the body of knowledge on earth, teach students, help students get jobs. Those are generally my outcomes, putting me on the spot for universities. And then there's so many things that go into outputs. So those are my outcomes. And there's so many things that go into outputs beneath it. But it all comes down to having and being able to articulate the logic model. If you're wrong, okay, you may not be perfect. I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect logic model for any of these things. But being able to explain your logic model too, when you share, and this is what I'm most proud of, putting in that context of the logic model is a scaffolding for the reading. Everyone, thank you. I had such a pleasure, honored to speak with you. I will write this up soon. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to add them on Twitter. It's probably the simplest way. So grateful. And if anyone wants individual advice, feel free to directly message if there's something. We believe in learning in public. I know. But if you really have a private question, I have a little bit of capacity. So feel free to send me an individual note. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for making time for this, and have a great start to your week. Take care, everybody.